But what do we really know of the man who became patron saint of Ireland? Images produced hundreds of years after he died mythologise him as a saintly patrician figure of the church. Yet the only things we really know about him are what he wrote in his own words in a document called his Confessio. It's the first document recorded in Ireland. Because of his ability to speak and write in Latin, Patrick's words are also the first account of a life in Ireland. Dr. Anthony Harvey has spent much of his career studying Patrick's document.
There's the real man, Patrick, who lived probably in the 5th century. We could call him Patrick with a capital P. And then the other thing isn't a man at all, it's a phenomenon, Patrick with a small p, which was developed for all sorts of reasons over the centuries. He was a bishop, we know that much, he says so, but I'm sure he didn't have any of the regalia that one would associate with the pictures that you would have these days. He was the son of a deacon somewhere in Britain, and from there, at the age of 16, he was snatched, brought to Ireland, and sold as a slave. And he was there for 6 years. After that, he escaped. He was back with his people, his family, in Britain, and he had a vision in which a man came from Ireland and read out to him a letter, the voice of the Irish, which was appealing to him to come back there. And he went voluntarily back to the very people who had enslaved him before. It would be as if someone who had been kidnapped by the Taliban and had escaped from them then voluntarily went back to them with the good news of the gospel.
Quite a dangerous place.
It was absolutely very dangerous, yes. Well, he could travel across these boundaries because he'd managed to fit himself into the society at the sort of higher level that could do that. He talks about princes and princesses of these very kingdoms in tears when they were converted, and it was an emotional thing, and it was a big change to everybody who adopted it.
And what of Patrick's banishing of the snakes from Ireland and his introduction of the shamrock as a symbol of the Holy Trinity?
To take the snake one first, you can see how it might have developed. He would have been seen as being the one who had expelled, paganism from Ireland. And because of biblical imagery, you could see that as associated with Satan the snake. So on that basis, Patrick had driven out the serpent. And then someone realized, well, there aren't any snakes in Ireland. Of course, we know that's because there never have been since the Ice Age. And so something which probably began as a sort of metaphorical statement, Patrick drove the serpent out of Ireland, was taken by someone else to be literal or symbolic. And from there, you got the sort of miracle story about him having done that.
And the shamrock being the representation of the Trinity?
Of the Trinity, yes. Well, it's quite a good symbol for that, the three in one, but there's no indication that Patrick ever used it.
So what kind of country was 5th century Ireland, and how did its people live?
An Ireland which was actually economically thriving, ironically enough, because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Lots of peoples on the edge of the Roman Empire did very well from the collapse of the Roman Empire. So we would have been trading very actively, and in many cases raiding very actively, along the west coast of Britain. For people today, it's very hard to imagine. It would have been very, very different. You've been talking about a very heavily forested country. There would have been small clearings and small communities, perhaps along river high, which were kind of the highways of the time for transport. People would have lived in maybe just extended family groups of no more than 100 or so. But there was no sense of kind of global sense of Irishness like we have today. So when I'm speaking to my students, I get them to try to imagine what it was like, and especially for the women in the class. You would have had pregnancy after pregnancy, and you'd been losing most of the babies. From what we can tell from the health and at that time and any kind of examination, infant mortality would have been very, very high. It would have been very, very hard life, and surviving the winter was difficult, and being able to store enough food was difficult. And just, even though they were quite good farmers, life would have been very, very hard compared to what we're used to today.
And why did Patrick's message have such appeal to these pagan people?
You have to remember that it was a revolutionary religion at the time. There's sort of such a funny view of Christianity in the 21st century. You have to remember, especially for women, that it was an equal opportunity religion. All souls are equal, and a lot of other religions before Christianity, all souls were not equal. So the message of redemption, the message of salvation, whether you were rich or poor, and if you're a very hierarchical society where the people at the bottom, the slaves and the people who had no status, their souls were as good as any wealthy chieftain's soul, and a woman's soul was as good as her brother's soul, and that was a new message. And perhaps that explains to some extent why it was so successful in Ireland so very quickly, which is one of the great mysteries of why there wasn't more resistance to it, and how native Irish society and Christian society seem to have merged so seamlessly into one another. I think he would have been just an extraordinarily powerful personality. Imagine keeping going for years without any idea if this would work, if this message of the gospel would actually take.